Hi everyone, my name is Robbie Egan and today I'm going to talk about the Green-Schools travel research entitled The Social Practice and Regulation of Cycling as a Boys' Thing in Irish Secondary Schools. So just to provide a bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So firstly, the origin of the anti-cyclist campaign itself, but also this research in particular. Secondly then, the methodology of the study, which was grounded theory using focus groups. Next, I'll talk about the theory itself, cycling as a social practice, regulation and reproduction as a boys' thing. Then I'll talk about the significance of the research mainly from an academic perspective, and then I'll talk about the applications and what it can actually be used for in policy and practice potentially. So just a bit about the origins then. So the main origin of the anti-cyclist campaign is the cycling gender gap in second level. So in Ireland, you have about 2.1% of teenage students cycling to school in particular. And of this, then there's about 3.7% are boys and only 0.4% are girls, according to Central Statistics Office data from 2016. And it seems that this kind of gender gap in cycling seems to persist into adulthood, albeit in a bit of a diluted form. So you have about in Ireland at the moment, about 2.6% of men reporting cycling regularly, for example, for a commute, and then 0.7% of women. And overall, then, the anti-cyclist campaign is designed to explore and address the second level cycling gender gap. So the methodology that I used in this study was grounded theory. What I would argue is a kind of critically adapted version of grounded theory. And grounded theory in general is used as a means of generating theory through the systematic collection and analysis of data instead of forcing or applying existing theory on data. So in this particular study, I didn't directly apply, but I was influenced by the gender theorists such as Butler, Connell, and Shippers. And the mode of data collection was qualitative focus groups with teenage girls and boys. There were 17 conducted in total, some of which were done remotely. 15 were with girls, 2 were with boys, and there were between 3 to 12 participants in these focus groups. So this is a general outline of the grounded theory that I developed, which is cycling as a boys thing. And you can see that cycling as a boys thing is the core category, it's the main one, and the ones underneath that are the sub-core categories and their properties. So the first one is incompatible femininity, by which I basically mean that the practice of cycling in its current form in Ireland is incompatible or is perceived as incompatible with the practices of a dominant form of femininity amongst adolescents in second level, adolescent girls in second level. Next then is exemplifying masculinity, that cycling is essentially used as a means of exemplifying or practicing various forms of a hegemonic adolescent masculinity in second level by teenage boys. And then lastly then gender regulation, by which I mean the social regulation of gender in Irish second level or amongst teenagers more broadly in Ireland. And you can see some of the properties there. Cycling as a girl is regulated, responsible cycling is regulated, and dressing like a boy is regulated. So the core category overall then is cycling as a boys thing. And what I mean when I refer to a boys thing is the social practice, regulation, and reproduction of cycling as a boys thing. And what I found with from my analysis of data from focus groups with girls and boys is that widely it's perceived as normal for boys to cycle, and it's socially deviant for girls to cycle. In one respect, you could say that the visible everyday practitioners of cycling are boys, and you can see that with the CSO statistics that I quoted earlier. As well, though, participants talked about this as well as a kind of widely shared meaning. You always see boys cycling in groups, and even the quote itself, cycling is a boys thing, was something that was commonly quoted by multiple participants. In this respect, then, cycling as a girl could be seen as a high-vis form of deviance, since you would probably be cycling on your own, and you'd be in some ways going against particular gender norms that relate to being a teenage girl. So in one respect, cycling as a boys thing can be seen as a social practice of boys, something that boys do, but also for boys. It's something that boys should do, or it's a gender norm for boys to engage in. It's something that just boys do, is cycle. So being a boy seems to be something that is part and parcel of that is potentially cycling. This is quite interesting because a lot of participants talked about in primary school how cycling was seen as natural for both boys and girls in many contexts. So something seems to change upon second level. So I would argue, based on my analysis, that a dominant hegemonic form of femininity and masculinity emerged in second level among adolescents. So those who are identified as female are regulated toward practices of hegemonic femininity, which include duty, care, restraint, and modesty. And then those who are identified as male are regulated toward hegemonic masculinity, which includes practices of athleticism, indifference, and audacity. So the links between this form of femininity and cycling are perceived or experienced as incompatible for teenage girls. And then for teenage boys, on the other hand, cycling is seen as a means of exemplifying practices of hegemonic masculinity. And amidst all this, then, a form of gender regulation takes place, which is formal and informal. For example, there could be laughs, there could be shouts, there could be different forms of harassment and humiliation as a means of making sure that people enact, so that girls enact this form of femininity, which involves beauty, care, restraint, and modesty, and that boys enact this form of hegemonic masculinity, which involves athleticism, indifference, and audacity. So there is a particular kind of style of cycling, not just cycling in itself, that is seen as a practice of masculinity when cycling, even though it is seen broadly as a boys' thing. So as one participant describes, I think it's like a thing for boys to cycle. I think it's just a thing for girls not to, and for boys too. So you can see here a real claim to gender difference and how cycling is a means of gender differentiation or a gender differentiating practice. And in contrast to in primary school, where cycling is seen as natural for girls and boys, in this case, in second level, it's described by teenage girls as just their nature for boys to cycle. So it's been reified that boys cycle in second level, when in the past it's seen as natural for both to cycle. So what's the significance of this research? Well, I think overall it shows how cycling as a teenage girl can be seen as a threat to men's exclusive possession of hegemonic masculine characteristics, which are performed through cycling, as I described in exemplifying masculinity. And then secondly, cycling as a teenage girl seems to constitute a refusal to embody the relationship between masculinity and femininity demanded by gender hegemony, which involves in a large part the performance of gender difference. So overall then, a boys' thing can be seen as a product of a gender regime within institutions of Irish second level, but also more generally in Irish society, a symptom of a wider gender order in which gender difference is performed by gender bodies and regulated both formally and informally. So I think overall this theory has two useful applications. Overall, I think it shows how intersectoral action is required to combat gender regime that reproduces cycling as a boys' thing. It's not just a transport issue, it's a gender issue. And I propose two approaches, one of which is a compatibility approach, which would involve making elements of cycling compatible with practices of hegemonic femininity, or a critical approach, which would involve challenging regulated gender performances at an individual, interactional, and institutional level. And they're just my references there. Thanks very much for listening.